Comrades, we have repeatedly given explanations on the legal procedure for restoring the work of the highest body of state power of the USSR. In order to organize the work of the councils in 2019, the chairman of the Central Election Commission of the RSFSR, Marina Vladimirovna Pugacheva, held hundreds of meetings, deliberations, sittings, and negotiations. Hundreds of packages of legal acts have been sent, including the resolutions of the Central Election Commission of the RSFSR adopted in 2019 and methodological recommendations regulating elections not only to the Supreme Council of the RSFSR, but also to local councils. Instead of ballots, a tabular form of vote counting was introduced. Initiative groups of citizens, having undergone training, held gatherings and meetings of citizens. Consulted on every issue. More than 200 local councils of people's deputies were created. Copies of the protocols were sent to the Central Executive Committee of the RSFSR. By decisions, resolutions, of the executive committees of local councils of people's deputies, electoral districts and district election commissions were created. As the result, by September 2019, 90 election commissions were operating, and a database of council deputies of all levels had been created. According to the proposal of the Mandatory Commission of the Supreme Council of the RSFSR, at the first session of the Supreme Council of the RSFSR of the 12th Convocation, held on September 15, 2019, the powers of 90 deputies elected on September 14, 2019 and registered by the Central Election Commission for elections to the Supreme Council of the RSFSR were recognized. The Presidium of the Supreme Council of the RSFSR was elected from among the deputies and the Council of Ministers of the RSFSR was created. Relying on the right of the highest authority of a Union Republic to participate in resolving an issue of national importance, recognizing that the chairman of the Presidiums of the Supreme Councils of the Union Republics are a priori deputy chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR, representing the interests of the 5 Union Republics, the Ukrainian SSR, the Belarusian SSR, the Georgian SSR, the Azerbaijan SSR and the Armenian SSR on the basis of the instructions given by the above-mentioned Union Fraternal Republics to represent and defend at the Genoa Pan-European Economic Conference of 1922 the interests of the said republics and to conclude and sign, on their behalf, both acts that may be developed at this conference, and any kind related directly or indirectly with this conference, certain international treaties and agreements with states, both represented at this conference and with all others, and to take all steps ensuing from this. The Supreme Council of the RSFSR, being the successor of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, convened the first session of the 12th Convocation of the Supreme Council of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics since October 27, 2019. Decree signed by the Deputy Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR from the RSFSR, Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the RSFSR Comrade Ivlevsky VN served as the basis for organizing and holding elections to the Supreme Council of the USSR. Legitimate bodies of state power are elected throughout the country, local and Supreme Councils of People's Deputies, in accordance with the Constitution of the USSR as amended in 1977 and the laws on elections to local and Supreme Councils of the Union and Union Republics. For progressive people today, the USSR is a bastion of rationality and democracy. Since May 5, 2020, with an open voting date, by-elections to the Supreme Council of the USSR of the 12th Convocation, that is, to the highest body of state power of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, were announced. Elections are an important socio-political event in the life of the peoples of our multinational Soviet state. These elections resulted in the unity of Soviet citizens around the Supreme Council of the USSR. The election campaign is taking place in an environment of political instability in the country. The legislative acts adopted by the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR, which reveal prospects for the further development of material and spiritual forces, and solve urgent problems to strengthen the peace and security of the state, have a huge impact on the entire course of the election campaign. During the activities of the Supreme Council of the USSR, the role and authority of the Soviets as organs of democracy increased noticeably.
The preliminary results of the elections to the Supreme Council of the USSR indicate the increasing civic responsibility and political consciousness of the Soviet people. During the election campaign, 28,000 people, or 99%, took part in voting for candidates for deputies of the Supreme Council of the USSR. All voters included in the lists. It is necessary to note the activities of individuals who united in groups in order to receive the reward promised to them for destabilization work of the Supreme Council of the USSR. As evidence of the legitimacy of their activities, they use resolutions and decrees signed by V.I. Ryunova on behalf of the Chairman of the Supreme Council of the USSR, Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR, and the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR, often referring to the resolution of the Supreme Council of the USSR dated April 16, 2018 No. 00048/16.04.2018 about the nationalization of power, political, economic, financial, judicial, executive, legislative and restoration of the rights of citizens of the USSR and the State of the USSR, signed by V.I. Ryunova, as Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR. Ryunova Valentina Ivanovna, according to the presented protocols, in 2018, citizens of the USSR organized congresses, at which, on the basis of the decision of the Council of People's Deputies of the Perm region of the RSFSR as part of the USSR of the Second Congress of the First Convocation dated January 21, 2018, the decision of the Council of People's Deputies of the Novosibirsk region of the RSFSR as part of the USSR of the Second Congress of the First Convocation dated February 02, 2018, decision of the Council of People's Deputies of the Voronezh region of the RSFSR within the USSR of the First Congress of the First Convocation dated February 02, 2018, Valentina Ivanovna Ryunova was appointed to the position of Chairman of the Supreme Council for the transition period. According to the USSR Constitution of 1977, Congress is not the highest body of state power. Therefore, in 2019, realizing her mistake, Ryunova V.I. decided to collect votes for the Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR in all regions. 456 votes have been collected that have no meaning. Since the Presidium, consisting of the Chairman, First Deputy, Secretary, and members of the Presidium, is elected from among the deputies of the Supreme Council of the USSR. Deputies, in turn, are elected from certain constituencies created within the framework of the election campaign for elections to the Council of the Union and for elections to the Council of Nationalities of the Supreme Council of the USSR. There is no information from which region Valentina Ivanovna Ryunova was elected as a People's Deputy of the Congress, and why she later began to be called the Chairman of the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Council.
It turned out that the election commissions of Moscow, the Moscow region and other electoral districts received the documents required for confessions of V.I. Ryunova were not nominated as candidates for the Supreme Council of the USSR. According to the presentation of the mandatory commission, V.I. Ryunova did not confirm her status as the deputy of the Supreme Council of the USSR. Thus, all officials appointed to the highest public positions of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR, the Council of Ministers of the USSR, the Prosecutor's Office of the USSR, the Supreme Court of the USSR are considered at the time of the start of the second session of the 12th elective convocation of the Supreme Council of the USSR to have been withdrawn, having lost their official powers until their powers are confirmed by the Supreme Council of the USSR. The Supreme Council of the USSR recognized the forged signature of V.I. Ryunova as illegal. Under any documents issued by her since February 2, 2018, on behalf of the Chairman of the Supreme Council of the USSR, the Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR and the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR. The Supreme Council of the USSR believes that all senior officials, those performing their duties in the period since February 2, 2018, up to April 26, 2020, actually carried out their official activities on a voluntary basis at the suggestion of VI Reunova. As the person who assumed the highest position in the state of the USSR, all documents signed by VI Reunova are insignificant continuers of the case of Reunova VI. The first of the characters, Nadezhda Ivanovna Chizevskaya, allegedly the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR, was reportedly the deputy of the Supreme Council of the RSFSR, Protocol of the Central Election Commission of the RSFSR dated September 14, 2019. She took part in the first session of the Supreme Council of the RSFSR on September 15, 2019. Her parliamentary powers were revoked ahead of schedule due to her failure to fulfill her parliamentary duties. The second character, Alexander Vasilyevich Neveditsyn, is allegedly the chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR. Facts presented by Neveditsyn AV in the biography you can see on the internet. Neveditsyn Alexander Vasilyevich appropriated the biography of a certain Shpilkin Vasily Alexandrovich. You can familiarize yourself with both the biography of Neveditsyn and the rhetorical manifestation of anti-Semitism by citizen Chizevskaya. None of the false deputies have presented or will be able to present documents confirming their election to the Supreme Council of the USSR. Also, documents confirming the resumption of the activities of the Supreme Councils of the USSR, of which they claim to be representatives, have not been published anywhere. Comrade deputies. The Joint Mandatory Commission of the Chambers of the Supreme Council of the USSR, the Council of the Union and the Council of Nationalities, guided by Art. 9 of the regulations on the standing commissions of the Council of the Union and the Council of Nationalities of the Supreme Council of the USSR, approved by the law of the USSR of October 12, 1967, as amended and supplemented by the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR of June 22, 1987, verified the powers of all deputies elected on October 27, 2023, to the Chambers of the Council of the Union and the Council of Nationalities of the Supreme Council of the USSR, and reports on the results of its work. To conduct elections to the Supreme Council of the USSR, the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR formed 750 electoral districts for elections to the Council of the Union and 750 electoral districts for elections to the Council of Nationalities. 2 districts for by-elections to the Council of Nationalities and 1 district for by-elections to the Council of the Union took an active part. For all 3 districts, the Central Election Commission of the USSR presented to the Mandatory Commission the protocols of the district election commissions, their statements of consent to run for office in the relevant districts, the voting protocols of the district election commissions, as well as other documents. The Mandatory Commission, having examined the materials received, established that the by-elections in the electoral districts were held in full accordance with the Constitution of the USSR of 1977 and the law on elections to the Supreme Council of the USSR of July 6, 1978 and 7772-9. Today, the deputies of the Supreme Council of the USSR have an equal number of men and women. This state of affairs in the highest body of state power of the USSR is the evidence of the growing socio-political activity of the population, one of the important manifestations of the truly democratic character of the Soviet social system. The Supreme Council of the USSR in its composition clearly shows the continuity of generations of our socialist society. The level of education of deputies is characterized by the following data: 80% have higher education, 20% have secondary vocational education. Deputies of 18 nationalities and nationalities were elected to the Supreme Council. It is necessary to strive for true equality and unbreakable friendship of all nations and nationalities living in the USSR. All those elected were not deputies of the Supreme Council of the USSR of the previous convocation. The Supreme Council of the USSR will have to resolve issues of state, economic and socio-cultural construction, and consistently implement the assigned tasks. The Mandatory Commission submits the following draft decision for consideration by the Supreme Council of the USSR. Having heard the report of the Joint Mandatory Commission of the Council of the Union and the Council of Nationalities, the Supreme Council of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics decides, based on Article 110 of the Constitution of the USSR, on the proposal of the Joint Mandatory Commission of the Council of the Union and the Council of Nationalities, recognize the powers of 3 deputies of the Supreme Council of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics elected to October 27, 2023. 1. Basarov Abdulaziz Kamaluddinovic, Dagestan Constituency No. 563, for elections to the Council of Nationalities from the RSFSR. 2. Taimanina Tatiana Alexandrovna, Komi Electoral District No. 417 for elections to the Council of the Union from the RSFSR. 3. Kurik Sergei Stepanovich, Moldavian Constituency No. 291 for elections to the Council of Nationalities from the Moldavian SSR. We would like to wish the newly arrived People's Deputies good health, prosperity and good fruitful work. Thank you for attention.